The silence that followed Nari's final words stretched across the great hall like a living thing. No one moved. No one spoke. No one seemed to breathe. The broken pieces of the force. Lance lay on the crystal floor, catching the light and throwing it back in fractured rainbows that somehow seemed sad and beautiful at the same time. Students from dozens of different species sat in their seats, staring at the human girl who had just done the impossible. Their minds were struggling to process what they had witnessed. How could someone destroy an advanced energy weapon with their bare hands? How could a peaceful academy student make a trained warrior step backward in fear? How could words be more powerful than the most deadly technology in the galaxy? Warlord Thexmar was the first to break the spell. He approached Nari slowly, his massive form moving with unusual care, like he was approaching something that might explode if disturbed. His compound eyes never left her face as he tried to understand what kind of creature stood before him. When he spoke, his voice had completely changed. Gone was the commanding boom that had filled the hall with menace. Instead, there was something that might have been curiosity mixed with a healthy dose of respect. Howie asked again, and this time the single word carried the weight of everything he did not understand. Nari looked up at the towering warlord, and her smile was patient and kind, like a teacher talking to a student who had just asked a very good question. The Force Lance works by containing massive energy in a stable field, she explained, her voice returning to its normal conversational tone. But every containment system has resonance frequencies. If you can match those frequencies and introduce harmonic interference. She shrugged like she was discussing the weather. Basic physics. The simplicity of her explanation somehow made what she had done even more shocking. She had not used some mysterious Deathworlder power or ancient human fighting technique. She had simply understood the weapon better than the person who was supposed to use it. Chancellor Morgeth found his voice first among the Academy faculty, though it took him several tries to get the words out. Ms. Kim, your knowledge of advanced energy systems is remarkable. Where did you learn such principles? High school physics, Nari replied, as if this should have been obvious. On Earth, understanding energy systems is not advanced science, it is survival. Our weather systems are seismic activity, our electromagnetic environment. If you cannot read energy patterns, you do not live long enough to have children. She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of students from dozens of species, all of whom were seeing her, and by extension all humans, with completely new understanding. Every Deathworlder learns to see the patterns that civilized species have forgotten how to recognize. We do not need to be violent, because we understand violence better than anyone else. We know exactly how dangerous we are, which is why we work so hard to be something better. The implications of her words rippled through the assembled crowd, like stones thrown into still water. If humans understood destruction so well that they could break advanced weapons with their bare hands, what did that say about their choice to be peaceful? If they were capable of such power, why did they choose diplomacy over conquest? Warlord Thexmar's posture had changed completely. The aggressive stance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. You could have destroyed the weapon at any moment during the demonstration, he said. It was not a question but a statement of dawning understanding. Yes, Nari said without hesitation. You could have turned it against us. Yes, but you chose to wait to speak first, to offer understanding before demonstrating power. Nari nodded. That is what diplomacy actually is. Not weakness pretending to be strength, but strength choosing to be patient. Warlord was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that reached far beyond this single encounter. His entire worldview had been built on the idea that the strong ruled and the weak served. But what happened when the truly strong chose not to rule? What happened when the most dangerous species in the galaxy decided to be teachers instead of conquerors? Finally, he turned to address the entire assembly, his voice carrying across the great hall with newfound humility. The Kreltar hegemony came here believing that civilization was a luxury that species could only afford when protected by warriors like ourselves. We have learned today that perhaps we have misunderstood what civilization truly means. He looked back at Nari, then at the Other humans in the audience seeing them clearly for the first time. We request permission to withdraw our ships from orbit and establish formal diplomatic relations with the Academy. It seems we have much to learn. The transformation in the hall was immediate and dramatic. Students who had been cowering in fear moments before were now sitting up straight and looking at each other with new expressions. Whispers began to spread through the crowd, but these were not the worried, frightened whispers of before. These were excited conversations about what they had just witnessed. The Etherians stopped flickering and began to glow with their natural luminescence. The Zephyrians' feathers regained their bright colors, and they began to make soft musical sounds of wonder. The Vortakians uncrossed their arms and stood tall with renewed pride, but the most dramatic change was in how they looked at the human students. Minho, Gina, and Dai found themselves surrounded by classmates who had never spoken to them before. Everyone wanted to know more about Earth, about Deathworlds, about how humans had learned to be so strong, while choosing to be so gentle. As the Kreltar delegation filed out of the Great Hall, their postures noticeably less aggressive than when they had arrived, the Academy erupted into conversations in dozens of languages. Students were asking questions, comparing notes, trying to understand what this meant for the future of galactic civilization. Nari returned to her seat among her human friends who looked at her with expressions of pride, amazement, and lingering shock. Minho was the first to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have you known you could do that?" Nari considered the question seriously. "I've always known I could break things," she said finally. "What I learned today was that sometimes the most important thing you can break is someone's assumptions about who you are." Gina leaned forward, her nervousness replaced by curiosity. "But how did you know it would work? What if the weapon had been too strong? What if you had been wrong about the resonance frequencies? Then I would have died," Nari said simply. "But I would have died showing them that humans are not afraid to stand up for what we believe in. Sometimes that is more important than surviving." The practical implications of what had happened began to spread across the galaxy within hours. News feeds carried the story to every inhabited system. The Academy application system was overwhelmed with requests from human students who had previously been denied admission. Diplomatic missions were hastily organized to establish contact with Earth government. In a dozen Kreltar systems, warlords who had ruled through fear began to question whether there might be a better way. Some began to study the Academy diplomatic protocols. Others started reaching out to species they had previously conquered to ask what kind of relationship they would prefer. But perhaps the most important change was in the Academy itself. When Nari walked through the crystalline corridors the next morning, she no longer walked alone. Students from every species fell into step beside her, eager to learn from the Deathworlder, who had shown them that true strength was not about the power to destroy but the wisdom to know when not to use it. The girl who had been silent for so long had finally found her voice, and the galaxy was listening. Her words had taught them that civilization was not something that made you weak. It was something that made your strength meaningful. And in classrooms across the Academy, teachers began to understand that maybe it was time to learn from their students, especially the ones who came from worlds that had taught them the hardest lessons of all. The age of the Deathworlders had begun not with conquest, but with understanding. Not with fear, but with hope. And the galaxy would never be the same. 3 weeks passed slowly at the Academy, and Nari thought things might stay the same forever. The alien students still whispered when she walked by. The teachers still treated humans like they were dangerous animals that might attack at any moment. The 4 human friends still ate alone in the cafeteria and studied together in empty classrooms. But then everything changed in a single day. It started during breakfast, when all the communication screens around the Academy began flashing with emergency messages. Students looked up from their meals with confused expressions on their faces. The screens usually showed daily announcements about classes and events, but today they were different. Today, they showed the seal of the Galactic Council and words that made everyone stop eating. Urgent political development. The screen said Kreltar hegemony requests Academy participation. Nari felt her stomach drop when she read those words. Everyone in the galaxy knew about the Kreltar hegemony. They were not like the peaceful species that sent students to the academy. The Kreltar were warriors who believed that might made right. They thought weak species should serve strong ones, and they were very good at making weak species agree with them. The hegemony was made up of 7 different warrior races who had joined together to conquer other worlds. They did not call it conquering, though. They called it bringing peace and stability to chaotic systems. What they really meant was that they would attack any planet that did not do what they wanted and keep attacking until everyone surrendered. In the past 10 years, the hegemony had brought their special kind of peace to 12 different star systems. Some of those systems had fought back for a while, but fighting the Kreltar was like fighting a hurricane. Eventually, you got tired and they did not park. Gina dropped her eating utensil, and it clattered on her tray, making a sound that seemed too loud in the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "What do they want with the academy?" she whispered. Her voice was shaking, and she was pulling on her hair the way she always did when she was scared. Lee Minho was reading the message again and again, like he could not believe what it said. "They want to participate in something," he said slowly. "They want to be part of some kind of academy program, Choi." Dai laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Great," he said. "Just great. Now we have actual warriors coming here to see how pathetic we all are. They will take one look around and decide the whole galaxy needs their kind of peace." Other students were having similar conversations in dozens of different languages. The musical voices of the Zephyrians sounded worried and off-key. The normally calm Etherians were moving in quick, jerky motions instead of their usual floating dance. Even the tall, proud Vortakians were hunching their shoulders like they were trying to make themselves smaller. An hour later, Chancellor Morgoth called an emergency assembly in the Great Hall. The Chancellor was very old even for a Celestian, and usually his voice was warm and kind, like a grandfather telling stories. But today he sounded tired and stressed. "Students and faculty," he began, his 6 arms moving in, gestures that showed he was deeply troubled. "We have received a formal request from the Kreltar hegemony. The request is for participation in our annual Galactic Peace Summit." A wave of whispers swept through the Great Hall. Everyone knew about the Peace Summit. It happened every year and was supposed to show how different species could work together to solve problems without fighting. The summit was one of the Academy's most important traditions, and students from every world participated. The core hegemony claims that their contributions to galactic stability have been overlooked. Chancellor Morgoth continued. His crystalline features seemed dimmer than usual, as if the stress was actually making him less bright. "They wish to demonstrate their approach to conflict resolution alongside our traditional diplomatic methods." What the Chancellor did not say, but everyone understood, was that the hegemony approach to conflict resolution involved making the other side too afraid or too dead to keep arguing. It was not really resolution at all, it was just winning through force. After the assembly, Nari found herself in advanced combat simulation class. This was one of the few classes where humans did well. The Academy taught combat simulation, not because they wanted students to fight, but because they believed understanding conflict could help prevent it. The class took place in a large room filled with obstacle courses and training equipment. Most alien students struggled with the physical challenges. Their peaceful worlds had not prepared them for anything requiring strength, speed, or quick reflexes. But humans had grown up on Earth where being slow or weak meant becoming food for something else. Today, Nari was running through an obstacle course that involved climbing, jumping, crawling, and lifting heavy objects. She moved through it like it was a game while other students watched in amazement. Even after 3 weeks at the academy, she could still surprise them with what her human body could do. When she finished the course, her instructor, Commander Velkan, approached her. Velkan was a Vortakian who had actually seen combat before coming to teach at the academy. He was the only teacher who did not seem afraid of the human students, and sometimes Nari thought he might actually respect them. "Kim," he said, using all 4 of his arms to gesture respectfully. "Your physical capabilities continue to impress me. Tell me, how do you feel about representing your species in a more visible capacity?" Before Nari could ask what he meant, the Academy announcement system activated again. This time it was Chancellor Morgoth's voice, but he sounded even more strained than before. "Attention all students and faculty. We have the honor of hosting representatives from the Kreltar hegemony for a special demonstration of interspecies cooperation. The event will take place in 3 days in the Great Hall. We encourage all students to attend this historic moment. Commander Velkon watched Nari carefully as the announcement played. Something is coming, he said quietly. Something that will change everything. The hegemony does not send representatives. They send messages. That evening, the 4 human students sat in their dormitory, common room, watching news feeds from across the galaxy. The reports were trying to sound neutral and professional, but it was easy to read between the lines. The Kreltar were moving, and moving fast. New reports showed hegemony fleets gathering in several star systems. Their newest member, the Apex Dominion, had just finished something called integration protocols on 2 more worlds. The news reports used careful language about minimal resistance and successful cultural alignment, but the images they showed told a different story. Empty cities, abandoned settlements, populations that had been relocated to special integration centers that looked a lot like prison camps. Minho turned off the news feed, his face pale. They are going to try to intimidate everyone, he said. They want to show the whole academy that their way is the only way that works in the real galaxy. Gina was hugging her knees to her chest and rocking back and forth. What if they decide Earth is too dangerous to leave alone, she whispered. What if they think humans are a threat that needs to be dealt with? What if they come for our families? It was a terrifying thought. Earth was far from the major space lanes and had only recently made contact with galactic civilization. Most humans still lived on their home planet, unaware that there were warrior species out there who might see them as enemies. Day stood up and began pacing around the small room. What if they are right, though? He said. What if all our talk about peace and diplomacy is just wishful thinking? What if the galaxy really is a place where only the strong survive and everyone else gets eaten? This was the question that scared all of them the most. What if the Kreltar were not evil? What if they were just honest? What if the universe really was a place where being peaceful meant being prey, and being civilized meant being dead? Nari had been quiet during this conversation, but now she stood up and walked to the window. The academy campus spread out. Below them, thousands of buildings where young beings from hundreds of different worlds lived and learned together. It was beautiful and peaceful, and everything that the Kreltar said was impossible. They are not right, she said, finally, her voice firm and clear. They are just louder than everyone else. But being loud does not mean being strong, and being strong does not mean being right. She turned back to face her friends, and they saw something in her eyes that reminded them of their shared heritage. Every human alive was descended from people who had faced impossible odds and survived. They carried in their genes the memory of ice ages and plagues and predators and disasters that would have destroyed weaker species. The Kreltar think strength means making others afraid, she continued. But real strength means protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Real strength means building something better than what came before. Real strength means choosing to be kind, even when you could choose to be cruel. Her friends looked at her with new understanding. They had been thinking like victims, like prey animals waiting for the predator to notice them. But they were not prey. They were the children of Earth. And Earth did not raise prey. In 3 days we are going to show them what Deathworlders are really made of, Nari said. Outside their window, the academy, peaceful campus, slept under alien stars, but change was coming, and the 4 humans could feel it in their bones. Soon, the galaxy would learn that there was more than one kind of strength, and more than one way to be dangerous. The Great Hall became so quiet that Nari could hear her own heartbeat. Every student, every teacher, every member of the Kreltar delegation was staring at her as she stood in the center of the massive room. The bright lights that had been installed for the demonstration cast harsh shadows across her face, but her expression remained calm and steady. Grixtal, the weapon-bearer, moved into position across from her. His exoskeleton gleamed under the lights, and the modifications built into his natural armor made soft clicking sounds as he adjusted his stance. The force lance in his primary manipulator hummed with deadly energy, its tip glowing with contained power that could cut through solid metal. Warlord Thexmar leaned forward in his throne, like chair, his compound eyes fixed on the human girl with predatory interest. "Begin your diplomacy, Deathworlder," he commanded, his voice echoing through the halls. Acoustic systems. What happened next would be talked about in diplomatic circles across the galaxy for years to come. Nari stood perfectly still and said absolutely nothing. The silence stretched like a rubber band being pulled tighter and tighter. 1 second passed, then 2. Students in the audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if something had gone wrong. 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. The Kreltar delegation exchanged glances, unsure if this was part of some human strategy. They did not understand. 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. Chancellor Morgoth leaned forward in his seat, concern creasing his ancient crystalline features. Was the girl frozen with fear? Had the sight of the weapon-bearer paralyzed her with terror? 9 seconds, 10 seconds. Grixtal interpreted the continued silence as either cowardice or disrespect. Neither was acceptable to a warrior of his standing. He took 1 step closer to Nari, his weapon rising to a more threatening position. The Force Lance energy field brightened, and its hum grew louder, filling the hall with the sound of barely contained destruction. 11 seconds, 12 seconds. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Some of the younger students were gripping their seats so hard their knuckles had turned white. Others were holding their breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the terrible quiet that had fallen over the demonstration. 13 seconds. Then Nari spoke, and her voice carried across the silent hall with devastating clarity. "You are afraid." The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Grixtal's weapon wavered slightly, as if the simple statement had somehow disrupted his balance. In the Kreltar delegation, several representatives actually took a step backward, their confident postures suddenly uncertain. Warlord Thexmar compound eyes widened in what might have been surprise or rage. "You came here with all your weapons and your threats and your demonstrations of power." Nari continued, her voice never rising above normal conversation level, but somehow filling every corner of the vast space. "You brought warships and battle formations and enough firepower to level a city, all to intimidate children." She took 1 step forward, just 1 small step, but the effect was immediate. Grixtal, the trained warrior, the experienced weapon-bearer, the creature who had faced enemies across a dozen star systems, instinctively stepped backward. The movement was tiny, barely noticeable, but everyone in the hall saw it. A human girl had made a Kreltar warrior retreat, without even raising her voice. "You are so afraid of what we might become that you cannot even imagine what we already are," Nari said, taking another step forward. "You see weakness where there is strength. You see civilization as surrender instead of evolution. You are so terrified of losing your dominance that you cannot conceive of a galaxy where strength serves something greater than itself." Her words were like hammer blows, each one striking at the foundation of everything the Kreltar believed. The idea that they were afraid was so alien to their worldview that they literally did not know how to respond to it. Grixtal tried to regain his composure by raising his weapon higher and activating more of its energy systems. The Force Lance now blazed with enough power to cut through a starship hull, but somehow the increased threat only made Nari seem calmer and more in control. "Let me tell you about Deathworlders," she said. And for the first time, there was something dangerous in her voice, something that made even Warlord Thexmar sit up straighter in his chair. "We do not survive because we are violent. We survive because we adapt. Every challenge our world threw at us we met and overcame. Not through conquest, but through resilience. Not through domination, but through cooperation." She was close now, close enough that Grixtal's weapon was almost touching her. The energy field crackled inches from her chest, hot enough to kill most species just from proximity. The air around the Force Lance shimmered with heat distortion, and the smell of ozone filled the immediate area. But Nari showed no fear, no hesitation, no sign that she was aware of the deadly energy weapon pointed at her heart. Instead, she continued speaking, as if she were having a casual conversation with a friend. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" she asked. "Real strength is building something better than what came before. Real strength is choosing compassion when violence would be easier. Real strength is protecting the weak instead of preying on them. Her hand began to move slowly, deliberately, like she was reaching for something. Everyone in the hall held their breath, expecting her to grab for the weapon or try to strike Grixtal, but instead she did something that defied all logic and understanding. She placed her palm directly against the Force Lance energy field. The weapon should have cut through her hand like paper. The energy field should have burned through flesh and bone in milliseconds. There should have been blood and screaming and the horrible smell of burned meat. Instead, something impossible happened. The field held for a moment, crackling against her skin like static electricity. Then, with a sound like breaking crystal, it began to destabilize. The weapon hum became a whine, then a shriek of failing systems. Sparks began to fly from the Force Lance internal components, and its energy output fluctuated wildly. Nari's voice remained perfectly calm, even as impossible. Energies played across her fingers. And sometimes real strength means showing someone that their weapon cannot protect them from the truth. She closed her hand around the Force Lance energy emitter. There was a flash of light bright enough to make everyone in the hall close their eyes. There was a sound like thunder rolling through mountains, and then there was silence. When the light faded and everyone could see again, Nari was standing exactly where she had been before, but now she was holding two pieces of what had once been one of the most advanced weapons in known space. The Force Lance designed to cut through the armor of battlecruisers had simply broken in her grip. The upper half of the weapon fell from her right hand with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. The lower half dropped from her left hand a moment later, landing on the crystal floor with a sound like a bell-tolling Grixtal, stared at the broken pieces of his weapon with an expression that would have been comical if the situation had not been so serious. His exoskeleton was still configured for combat, but he no longer had anything to fight with. His primary manipulator opened and closed uselessly as his brain tried to process what had just happened. In the audience, students from dozens of species sat frozen in their seats. Their understanding of physics, of technology, of what was possible and what was impossible had just been shattered as completely as the weapon on the floor. Warlord Thexmar was the first to move. He rose from his throne-like chair and approached Nari slowly, his massive form casting a shadow over her but somehow not making her seem small or threatened. When he spoke, his voice had lost its commanding boom and carried instead a note of something like respect. How, he asked simply. Nari looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the hall, she smiled. It was not a cruel smile or a triumphant one. It was the patient smile of a teacher about to explain something important to a student who had just discovered they had much to learn. Diplomacy, she said quietly, does not mean being helpless. It means choosing not to use the power you have. Kim Nari walked down the long, bright hallway of the Galactic Academy. Her footsteps made loud sounds on the shiny floor, while other students moved quietly around her. The walls were made of some kind of crystal that showed rainbow colors when light hit them. Everything in this place was beautiful and perfect and clean. Nari kept her eyes down as she walked. She could feel the other students looking at her. Some whispered to their friends when she passed by. Others just stared with big, curious eyes that made her skin feel hot with embarrassment. She was different from everyone else here, and they all knew it. The academy was home to students from hundreds of different planets. Most of them looked nothing like humans. There were the Etherians, who had skin you could see through like glass and moved like they were floating in water. There were the Vortakians, who were twice as tall as humans and had 4 long arms that bent in ways that hurt to look at. There were the Zephyrians, who had bright-colored feathers instead of hair and made musical sounds when they talked. All of these alien students had one thing in common. They came from worlds that were safe and peaceful. Their planets had perfect weather and no dangerous animals. There, people had learned to live without war or violence a long time ago. They thought they were better than humans because of this. Nari understood why they looked at her the way they did. She came from Earth, and Earth was what the galaxy called a death world. It was a planet where everything tried to kill you. The weather could freeze you or burn you to death in minutes. The ground could shake and crack open without warning. Wild animals hunted in packs, and even the air could poison you if you breathed it in the wrong places. Humans who lived on Earth had to be tough just to survive one day. Most species in the galaxy could not live on Earth for even an hour without special protection suits. But humans had been born there and grew up there and learned to call it home. This made other species think humans were wild and dangerous like the planet they came from. The morning classes were always hard for Nari. Not because the work was difficult, but because of how the teachers and other students treated her. In advanced mathematics, the Etherian professor would ask questions to every student except the humans. In galactic history, the Zephyrian teacher would talk about how primitive and backward Earth was compared to other worlds. And in science class, the Vortakian instructor would make jokes about how humans still used violence to solve problems. But the worst class was advanced galactic diplomacy. Professor Vexthara was a spider-like creature with 6 eyes and a voice that sounded like metal scraping against stone. She seemed to enjoy making the human students feel small and stupid. Today, Professor Vexthara was talking about conflict resolution, like she did every day. She believed that all problems in the galaxy could be solved. By talking and making agreements, she thought violence was something only primitive species used. Professor Vexthara looked around the classroom with her 6 eyes moving in different directions. The alien students sat up straight in their special chairs that were made for their different body types. The human students sat in the back corner in regular chairs that were too small and uncomfortable. When faced with an aggressive species, what is the preferred diplomatic approach? Professor Vexthara asked. Her voice was cold and formal, like she was reading from a book. Several alien students raised their hands or tentacles or whatever they used to show they wanted to speak. Professor Vexthara chose a tall blue Celestian student who had crystals growing out of her head. The answer is obviously peaceful negotiation, the Celestian said in a voice that sounded like singing. We must show aggressive species that violence is not necessary when we can share resources and knowledge. Excellent answer, Professor Vexthara said. Her mandibles clicked together in what might have been a smile. Very civilized thinking. In the back corner, Lee Minho slowly raised his hand. Minho was another human student who had come to the academy from one of the outer colonies where humans had built small settlements. He was quiet and shy and always seemed scared that he would say something wrong. Professor Vexthara looked at him for a long moment, like she was deciding whether to let him speak. Finally, she nodded. What about negotiation through strength? Minho asked quietly. His voice was so soft that other students had to lean forward to hear him. I mean, showing that you can defend yourself while still trying to talk things out. The classroom went silent for a moment. Then some of the alien students began to make soft musical sounds. It took Nari a moment to realize they were laughing at Minho. The sounds were not mean or cruel, but somehow they felt worse than if the students had been obviously making fun of him. Professor Vexthara mandibles clicked faster. Typical Deathworlder thinking, she said. Violence is never the answer in civilized society. Young human, you must learn that strength means nothing compared to wisdom and understanding. Nari felt her hands close into fists under her desk. She wanted to stand up and tell Professor Vexthara that she was wrong. She wanted to explain that humans did not love violence the way everyone thought they did. She wanted to say that surviving on a death world had taught humans things that peaceful species could never understand. But Nari said nothing. She had learned early in her time at the academy that speaking up only made things worse. When humans tried to defend themselves, the alien students and teachers just saw it as proof that they were violent and primitive. It was better to stay quiet and let them think what they wanted to think. After class ended, the students began to leave in their usual groups. The Etherians floated together in a cluster that looked like living clouds. The Vortakians walked in a line with their 4 arms moving in perfect rhythm. The Zephyrians flew in small circles above the other students, singing to each other in their musical language. The human students waited until most of the aliens had left before they got up from their seats. There were only 4 humans in the whole academy, and they usually stuck together, not because they were best friends, but because no one else wanted to be around them sides. Nari and Minho. There was Park Gina, who was always nervous and worried about everything. She had a habit of playing with her hair when she was scared, which was most of the time. There was also Choi Dae, who tried to act tough, but everyone could see he was just as uncomfortable as the rest of them. As they walked toward their dormitory, Gina kept looking around like she expected someone to jump out and yell at them. Maybe we should transfer to the technical programs, she whispered. Even though they were alone, she still talked quietly like she was afraid someone might hear. The technical programs were where students learned to fix machines and build things. Most of the alien species did not like getting their hands dirty with manual labor, so the technical programs had mostly humans and a few other species that were considered less civilized. Day nodded quickly. I heard the maintenance crews do not mind working with humans. We are good with tools and fixing things, right? That is something we can do without making anyone uncomfortable. Minho looked like he wanted to agree, but also like he wanted to argue. But we earned our spots here. He said our test scores were just as high as any of the alien students. We proved we belong in the academic programs. This was true. All 4 human students had scored in the top 10% of applicants to the academy, but high test scores did not change the way other species saw them. Most aliens believed that humans were naturally violent and could not be trusted with important diplomatic or scientific work. Nari had been quiet during this conversation, but now she stopped walking. The other 3 humans stopped too and looked at her. They could tell she wanted to say something important. They think we are primitive because we come from a world that tried to kill us every day, Nari said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made the others pay close attention. They do not understand that surviving Earth did not make us savage. It made us strong. The 4 friends stood in the empty hallway thinking about what she had said. They all knew it was true. Every human carried inside them the knowledge of what it meant to face death and choose to keep living. They had all grown up on a world where being weak meant dying, where being stupid meant not seeing tomorrow, where giving up meant the end of everything. But they also knew that this strength scared the other species. The aliens looked at humans and saw creatures who came from violence and chaos. They could not imagine that the same forces that made humans dangerous had also made them wise. As they continued walking, none of them noticed the small floating device that had been following them. It looked like a maintenance drone, but it was actually recording everything they said and sending the information to someone very far away. Someone who was very interested in what the human students were thinking and feeling. That night, Nari lay in her bed in the human dormitory staring up at the ceiling. She thought about what Minho had said in class about negotiation through strength. She thought about how the other students had laughed and how Professor Vexthera had dismissed the idea without even thinking about it. What the aliens did not understand was that strength did not have to mean violence. Strength could mean knowing when to fight and when not to fight. Strength could mean protecting people who could not protect. The morning of the 3rd day started with fear. Students woke up to see the sky above the academy filled with shapes that had not been there the night before. The Kreltar ships hung in orbit like dark clouds blocking out the stars. Each ship was bigger than most academy buildings and covered with weapons that were clearly visible even from the ground. The ships did not dock at the peaceful civilian ports like normal visitors. Instead, they formed a battle formation that every military expert in the galaxy would recognize as an attack pattern. The message was clear. We come in peace, but we are ready for war if anyone wants to try. Asnari stood at her dormitory window, looking up at the threatening shapes above. She had seen pictures of Kreltar warships before, but seeing them in person was different. They were built for one purpose, only to destroy anything that opposed them. There was no beauty in their design, no attempt to make them look peaceful or friendly. They were tools of conquest, and they wanted everyone to know it. Breakfast in the academy cafeteria was a strange, quiet affair. Students from dozens of species sat at their usual tables, but no one was talking much. The cheerful morning chatter that usually filled the room was replaced by nervous whispers and worried glances toward the windows. The Etherians, normally so graceful and flowing, seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like they were trying to disappear. The Zephyrians' feathers had lost their bright colors and turned dull gray. The Vortakians kept all 4 of their arms crossed defensively, and their usually proud postures had become hunched and small. Even the teachers looked worried. Professor Vexthera, who usually acted like she knew everything about everything, kept checking her communication device like she was waiting for news that might never come. Commander Velkan was nowhere to be seen, and rumors were spreading that he had been called away for emergency security meetings. At exactly 10 in the morning, the Academy announcement system activated, with a sound that made everyone jump. All students and faculty report to the Great Hall immediately. Chancellor Morgoth's voice said through the speakers, "The Kreltar delegation has arrived, and the demonstration will begin shortly." The walk to the Great Hall felt like a march to an execution. Students moved in nervous groups, staying close to their own species and speaking in hushed voices. The hallways that usually rang with laughter and conversation were filled with the sound of footsteps and quiet breathing. When they reached the Great Hall, Nari gasped. The massive room had been changed. Everything that could be moved had been pushed to the sides, creating a large, open space. In the center, new lighting had been installed that cast harsh shadows instead of the usual warm glow. And at the far end of the hall, a section had been set up with chairs that looked like thrones. But the most shocking change was the beings sitting in those throne-like chairs. The Kreltar delegation was unlike anything most Academy students had ever seen in person. They were not the peaceful civilized species that normally visited the Academy. These were warriors from worlds where only the E-I-N-D-D strong survived and the weak became food. At the center of the group sat someone who could only be their leader. He was massive, even sitting down, and his body was covered in what looked like natural armor that had been carved with symbols and markings. Every piece of that armor told a story of battles fought and worlds conquered. His face was hard and predatory, with eyes that seemed to see everything as either threat or prey. This was Warlord Thexmar of the Apex Dominion, and just looking at him made it clear why his species had become the newest and most feared members of the Kreltar hegemony. He was a creature designed by evolution to hunt and kill, and he wore that design like other beings. War Clothes Chancellor Morgoth stood at the front of the hall, looking very small next to the massive warrior. The elderly Celestian's crystalline features seemed dim and fragile compared to Thexmar's armored bulk. When he spoke, his voice carried across the hall, but it sounded weak and uncertain. "Welcome, our honored guests from the Kreltar hegemony." The Chancellor said, "We hope this demonstration will show the value of peaceful cooperation between different species." Warlord Thexmar stood up, and the simple action seemed to fill the entire hall with menace. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding stone, and every word carried the weight of absolute authority. "We greet the scholars of this academy," he said. The translation devices built into the hall's systems carried his words to every species present, but they could not translate the undertone of barely controlled violence that colored every syllable. "We come to observe how you prepare the young for the realities of galactic existence." The way he said realities made it clear that he thought the Academy version of reality was a fairy tale told to children to help them sleep at night. Chancellor Morgoth tried to maintain his diplomatic composure. "We believe that understanding between species can overcome any obstacle," he said. "With education and cooperation, we can solve any problem that arises." The Warlord's laugh was like breaking rocks. It echoed through the Great Hall and made several students visibly flinch. Understanding is a luxury afforded to species that have never faced real adversity. "Tell me, Chancellor, how many of your graduates have ever had to fight for their survival? How many have looked death in the face and chosen to live?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Most of the students in the hall came from worlds where death was a medical inconvenience rather than a daily threat. They had never known hunger or cold, or the fear of predators stalking them in the dark. Their civilizations had moved past such crude concerns long ago. In one small section of the hall, 4 young humans sat perfectly still. They had all looked death in the face every day of their lives on Earth. They had breathed air that could kill them, walked on ground that could swallow them whole, and lived under a sun that could burn them to ash in hours. They understood mortality in ways these other species could not imagine. Warlord Thexmar's eyes swept across the assembled students with predatory interest. Perhaps the Chancellor said carefully, "We could arrange a demonstration of our conflict resolution protocols. Our students have trained extensively in peaceful negotiation techniques." "An excellent suggestion," the Warlord said, and his voice carried the tone of someone announcing an execution. "I propose a simple challenge. Let any of your students attempt to resolve a conflict with my personal weapon bearer Grixtal. A peaceful resolution to a violent encounter. He gestured and another figure stepped forward from the Kreltar delegation. Grixtal was smaller than the Warlord, but no less frightening. His body was covered in an exoskeleton that had been modified with what looked like combat improvements. Sharp edges and weapon mounts were built into his natural armor, and his movements were quick and precise like a machine designed for killing. In his primary manipulator, he held a weapon that made several students gasp. It was a force lance capable of cutting through starship armor like paper. The energy field around its tip hummed, with barely contained power that could vaporize most organic matter in seconds. The rules are simple. Warlord. Thexmar continued. My weapon bearer will demonstrate aggressive postures. Your student will attempt to de-escalate using words alone. When diplomacy fails, as it always does, the demonstration will end. Everyone in the hall understood what he really meant. This was not a demonstration. It was a public humiliation designed to prove that peaceful species were helpless against violent ones. The academy would be forced to watch one of their students cower before a warrior, and then everyone would know that the Kreltar way was the only way that worked. Chancellor Morgoth found himself trapped. If he refused the challenge, it would trigger an incident that could lead to war. If he accepted it, he would be sacrificing a student to prove a point about the futility of peace. In the tense silence that followed, a voice cut through the air with startling clarity. I will do it. Every head in. The great hall turned to see Nari standing up in the human section. Her voice had not been loud, but it carried clearly across the vast space. She began walking toward the center of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Behind her, Minyo half rose from his seat. Nari, do not. She did not look back, but her voice carried just far enough for her friends to hear. Trust me, as she approached the center of the hall. Warlord. Thexmar studied her with new interest. Here was something he had not expected. Not the trembling scholar he had anticipated, but a young human female, who moved with the controlled confidence of a predator. For the first time since arriving, he felt a flicker of genuine curiosity. You are volunteering, he asked, his tone suggesting this might be more interesting than he had planned. Nari stopped exactly 3 meters from Grixtal, close enough to show courage, far enough to avoid appearing threatening. She looked up at the massive warlord with steady eyes that showed no fear at all. Yes, she said simply. I am. The demonstration was about to begin, but something had already changed. In that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted in ways that nobody, not even Nari herself, fully understood. The Kreltar had come expecting to find weak prey, but instead they had found something much more dangerous. They had found a human who was no longer afraid.